What if everything you were taught about the Apache was built on a map that never actually existed? What if the blood running through their veins holds a secret that crosses an entire ocean, rewriting centuries of history in a single strand of DNA? If you have ever felt that the past hides more than it reveals, tap like right now. Subscribe to join us as we uncover the stories they never taught you. And share this with someone who still believes history is settled. For generations, the story was simple, clean, almost too neat. The Apache were painted as desert warriors, masters of survival, descendants of northern hunters who slowly walked south over hundreds of years. Textbooks placed them in a straight line. They started in the frozen forests of Canada and Alaska. They followed game. They followed seasons. They followed a path that made logical sense to historians and linguists. Their language tied them to the Athabaskan family. That family stretches from the icy coasts of Alaska all the way down to the sun-baked canyons of Arizona and New Mexico. The connection seemed unbreakable. The migration theory fit perfectly. It was comfortable. It was accepted. It was repeated until it became fact. But comfort is not the same as truth, and acceptance is not the same as proof. Long before laboratories could read the code inside human cells, the Apache carried their own memories. They spoke of origins that did not match the straight lines drawn by academics. They told stories of long journeys, yes, but also of strange meetings, of waters that moved like rivers in the sea, of ancestors who arrived from directions that made no sense on a modern map. Scholars listened politely. Then they filed those stories away. Oral tradition was beautiful, they said, but it was not data. It was not evidence. It was not science. Then science caught up, and science did not care about comfort. In the early years of this century, geneticists began doing something that would have sounded like magic just a few decades earlier. They started reading the full human genome, not the simplified reports you get from a mail-order kit, not the broad percentages that tell you which continent your ancestors might have walked. They were looking at the deep architecture of human movement. They were tracing lineages that split thousands of years ago. They were mapping the invisible roads our ancestors took long before anyone wrote anything down. When they turned that technology toward indigenous populations across the Americas, they expected to confirm what they already believed. They expected to see the familiar pattern, a founding population crossing the ancient land bridge, a slow spread southward, a clean branching of families and languages. For many groups, that is exactly what they found. The data matched the maps. The maps matched the textbooks. The circle closed neatly, but when they looked at the Apache, the circle broke. Buried inside the genetic code was a signal that should not have been there. It was not loud, it was not dominant, but it was consistent. It appeared across multiple samples. It showed up in different studies. And it pointed in a direction that made historians uncomfortable. It did not point north to the subarctic. It did not point west to the Siberian coast. It pointed across the Pacific. Specifically, it carried markers that aligned most closely with coastal East Asia. Not the ancient Siberian DNA that all Native Americans share. Something different. Something that arrived later. Something that did not fit the timeline. Something that did not fit the map. The researchers did not rush to headlines. Good science never does. They used careful words. They noted limitations. They suggested alternative explanations. But the signal refused to disappear. Every time they ran the models, it stayed. Every time they expanded the reference panels, it grew clearer. The data was saying something simple and unsettling. The Apache were not just the descendants of northern hunters walking south. They carried a second story inside them, a story that crossed water, a story that history had completely missed. This is where the ground shifts, because once you accept that the DNA is real, you have to explain how it got there. And that is where the arguments begin. That is where the comfortable story falls apart. The first explanation was the safest. Maybe a second wave of migrants crossed the ancient land bridge long after the first. Maybe they carried this distinct East Asian signature. Maybe they mixed with northern groups before those groups moved south. It was a tidy idea. It required no major revisions. It kept the map intact. But when geneticists ran the clocks, the numbers fought back. The divergence dates did not match a late land bridge crossing. The signal was too recent for that route. The timeline collapsed under its own weight. The second explanation was harder to swallow. Maybe people crossed the ocean. Not Vikings, not Polynesians, but maritime communities from the coasts of China or Japan. Maybe they rode the Great Pacific Currents. Maybe they landed on the northwest coast of North America. Maybe they survived. Maybe they merged with local populations. Maybe their descendants slowly moved inland over generations. Maybe their blood eventually reached the people who would become the Apache. It sounds like fiction until you look at the water. The Kuroshio Current is real. It flows like a river in the sea. It starts near the Philippines. It sweeps past Japan. It arcs across the North Pacific. It touches the shores of Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia. It has been doing this for thousands of years. We know this because history recorded it. In the 1800s, Japanese fishing boats caught in storms were carried across that current. Some washed ashore on the American coast. Some crews were still alive when they hit the sand. They did not navigate deliberately. The ocean carried them. If it happened in recorded history, why would it be impossible in ancient times? The current does not care about calendars. It does not care about textbooks. It only cares about wind and water and time. The third explanation was the quietest, but perhaps the most human. Maybe the Apache were never a single line. Maybe they were a gathering. Maybe as they moved, as they adapted, as they survived, they absorbed other groups. Maybe one of those groups carried this East Asian signature. Maybe that group arrived by a route we have not yet mapped. Maybe they merged so completely that their language faded, their customs blended, and only their DNA remained. Peoples are not static. They are living networks. They grow. They change. They take in strangers and make them family. The genome does not lie about that. It records every merger, every meeting, every quiet moment when two paths became one. 3 explanations, none of them perfect, all of them pointing to the same uncomfortable truth. The old map is wrong, or at least it is incomplete. And when a map is incomplete, the people who live outside its lines get erased. If this is shifting the way you see history, pause for just a second. Drop a comment with the word current so I know you're still with me. Hit subscribe to keep unraveling the past with us, and send this to someone who thinks every mystery has already been solved. Let us step back from the theories for a moment. Let us look at what the science actually did, because understanding the method changes how you hear the result. Genetic ancestry is not a photograph. It is a mosaic. Every person carries thousands of fragments from thousands of ancestors. Most of those fragments are shared with millions of other people, but some are rare, some are specific. Some act like fingerprints left on a windowsill centuries ago. When researchers sequence a genome, they are not looking for a single marker. They are looking for patterns. They are comparing those patterns against massive databases. They are asking a simple question: which living populations share the closest match to this specific arrangement of code? When they asked that question about the Apache signal, the answer kept pointing to the same region, coastal East Asia, not the broad Siberian ancestry that forms the foundation of indigenous American DNA. Something layered on top of it, something that arrived later, something that did not travel over ice. The divergence models place the split somewhere between 500 BCE and 1000 CE. In genetic terms, that is yesterday. It is not ancient prehistory. It is a time frame that overlaps with recorded civilizations. It is a time frame that makes transoceanic movement plausible, even likely if you accept that humans have always been braver than we give them credit for. The lead researchers did not claim they had solved the mystery. They said the opposite. They said the data was difficult to explain using the standard overland model. That phrase matters. In scientific language, difficult to explain is not a shrug. It is a flare. It means the current framework is cracking. It means the evidence is pushing against the walls of what we thought was possible. It means someone needs to draw a new map. And this is where the story stops being just about genetics. It becomes about memory. It becomes about identity. It becomes about who gets to decide what is real. For over a century, the Apache were studied through a very specific lens. They were framed as warriors, as nomads, as survivors of a harsh landscape. Later, they were framed as linguistic cousins of northern tribes, as migrants who followed a predictable path. Both frames were built by outsiders. Both frames ignored the parts that did not fit. Both frames turned a living, breathing, adapting people into a neat category on a chart. But people are not categories. People are collisions. They are meetings. They are accidents and choices and survivals stacked on top of each other until they become a culture. The DNA does not erase the Apache story. It deepens it. It adds a chapter that was never written down. It says that somewhere, in their past, there was a meeting that changed everything. Maybe it was a boat hitting a shore. Maybe it was a stranded group finding shelter. Maybe it was a quiet exchange of food, of words, of lives. Maybe it was love. Maybe it was necessity. Maybe it was both. The genome does not record motives. It only records results, and the result is clear. The Apache carry a lineage that crossed an ocean. Think about what that means in human terms. Not academic terms, human terms. Imagine a group of fishermen pushing off from a coastal village. The sky is clear, the water is calm. They know these waters. They have read the tide since they were children. Then the wind shifts, the current grabs them, the land disappears, days pass, maybe weeks. The sun burns, the rain soaks, the wood creaks. They pray to gods they hope are listening. Then, through the fog, a new coastline appears. It is not home, it is strange. The trees are different, the birds are different, the air smells different. They step onto the sand. They do not know if they will survive. They do not know if they will be welcomed. They only know they are alive. Now imagine the people already living on that coast. They see strangers emerge from the water. They do not share language. They do not share customs. But they share hunger. They share fear. They share the basic human instinct to keep breathing. Maybe there is tension, maybe there is caution, but maybe over time there is also exchange. A tool is shared, a fire is lit, a meal is cooked, a child is born, a lineage begins. This is not fantasy. This is how human history actually works. We like to imagine clean borders, pure bloodlines, straight migrations, but the Earth does not work that way. The Earth is messy. The Earth is connected. Wind moves, water moves, people move, and when people move, they leave traces, sometimes in stone, sometimes in stories, sometimes in blood. The Apache oral traditions have always hinted at this messiness. They speak of long journeys, yes, but also of encounters, of learning from strangers, of adapting to new lands, of carrying knowledge from places they no longer remember. Academics used to dismiss those details as metaphor. Now, genetics is asking us to take them literally, not as perfect historical records, but as echoes of real events, real meetings, real survivals. And this brings us to a harder question. Why does this matter? Why should we care about a genetic signal in a specific population? Why does it change anything? It matters because history is not just about the past. It is about who we are allowed to be in the present. When we flatten a people into a single story, we strip them of their complexity. We turn them into symbols instead of humans. The Apache were never just desert fighters. They were never just northern migrants. They were adapters. They were survivors. They were collectors of knowledge. They were a people who absorbed what worked and left behind what did not. The DNA confirms what their culture already demonstrated. They were never isolated. They were connected, to the north, to the south, and it now appears to the west, across water, across time, across the kind of distance that makes the human story feel impossibly large. If you're feeling that shift in perspective, do me a favor. Tap the share button and send this to one person who needs to hear that history is still breathing. Subscribe so you never miss the next layer we peel back, and leave a comment telling me which part of this story hit you the hardest. I read every single one. Let us talk about what happens when science and tradition finally stop fighting each other. Because for too long, they have been treated as enemies. One side claims only data matters. The other side claims only memory matters. But the truth lives in the space between them. The geneticists who found this signal did not set out to rewrite Apache history. They were building a global map of human movement. They were looking at broad patterns. They were not focused on one tribe. They were not looking for controversy. But the data does not care about intentions. The data speaks when it is ready. And when it spoke, it said something that aligned strangely with what Apache elders had been saying for generations. We came from far away. We met others. We changed. We adapted. We are not a straight line. We are a weaving. One elder, speaking quietly to a researcher, put it in words that have stayed with me. She said they always knew their roots reached beyond the mountains. They just did not know how far. That is not a rejection of science. It is an invitation to it. It is a reminder that indigenous knowledge is not primitive. It is patient. It watches. It remembers. It waits for the rest of the world to catch up. And now the rest of the world is catching up. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough to change the conversation. Enough to admit that the Pacific was not a wall. It was a road. A dangerous one. An unpredictable one. But a road nonetheless. Humans have always been drawn to horizons. We have always built boats. We have always tested the water. The idea that ancient people stayed neatly in their lanes is a modern fantasy. It comes from a time when we forgot how to look at the sky and read the wind. It comes from a culture that built borders and assumed everyone else did too. But the ocean does not recognize borders. The current does not ask for passports. The wind does not care about academic departments. It only moves. And where it moves, people follow, or people are carried, or people survive. This is why the Apache DNA finding is not just a scientific footnote. It is a mirror. It shows us how small our maps have been. It shows us how much we have missed by assuming that history only moves in straight lines. It shows us that the people we thought we understood were carrying secrets in their cells that no textbook could hold. And it forces us to ask a quieter, heavier question. If the Apache story is more complex than we thought, whose else is? How many other populations carry hidden meetings in their blood? How many other oral traditions are waiting for technology to finally listen? How many other maps are wrong? The answer is probably most of them. Because human history is not a series of isolated boxes. It is a web. It is tangled. It is overlapping. It is full of accidents and miracles and quiet survivals that never made it into the official record. The genome is finally giving us the tools to see that web. But the tools are only as good as the minds using them. If we approach the data with rigid expectations, we will miss the truth. If we approach it with humility, we might finally start to understand who we really are. Consider how deeply this changes our understanding of survival. The Apaches are famous for their resistance. They fought empires. They outmaneuvered armies. They adapted to deserts that broke seasoned soldiers. We celebrate their toughness. We should. But toughness is only half the story. The other half is flexibility, the ability to take in the new, the ability to merge without losing yourself, the ability to turn a stranger into a relative. That is not weakness. That is the highest form of strength. And the DNA proves they practiced it long before anyone was watching. Think about the generations that carried this hidden lineage. They did not know about chromosomes. They did not know about haplogroups or divergent states. They only knew their families. They only knew their land. They only knew the stories passed down by firelight. Yet inside them, the evidence traveled, quietly, faithfully, waiting for a century that could finally read it. That is a kind of patience that humbles modern science. We rush to publish. We rush to claim. We rush to be first. But the genome does not rush. It simply holds the truth until we are ready to face it. And facing it requires courage, because every time we rewrite history, we also rewrite ourselves. We have to let go of certainty. We have to admit we were wrong. We have to sit with the discomfort of not knowing everything. That is hard for academics. It is hard for institutions. It is hard for anyone who built a career on a clean narrative. But it is necessary, because a clean narrative that ignores evidence is not history. It is fiction dressed up as fact. The Apache never asked for a clean narrative. They asked for survival. They asked for respect. They asked to be seen as they are, not as outsiders wanted them to be. The genetic data does not give them respect. They already have that. But it does give them validation. It says their complexity is real. It says their origins are wider than we allowed. It says their story belongs to the whole human family, not just a single branch on a tree. This is where the conversation turns inward. Because if the Apache carry a hidden crossing, what do you carry? What meanings live in your cells? What forgotten journeys shaped your face, your hands, your instincts? We all come from somewhere. But that somewhere is never just one place. It is a chain of choices, accidents, storms, and shelters. It is a chain of people who refuse to give up. The Apache remind us of that. They remind us that identity is not a wall. It is a door, and doors are meant to open. Stand in the high desert at dusk, watch the light fade over the ridges, feel the wind move through the dry grass. This is the land the Apache defended. This is the land they adapted to. This is the land that shaped them. But it is not the only land that shaped them. Somewhere in their past, there was water, there was a boat, there was a crossing, there was a moment when one world touched another and neither was the same after. You cannot see that moment. In the rocks, you cannot dig it up with a shovel, you cannot find it in a colonial ledger, but you can find it in a strand of DNA. You can find it in the quiet architecture of a cell. You can find it in the blood of people who walk the desert today, carrying a history they never asked for, but somehow always knew. That is the beauty of this discovery. It does not erase the Apache. It honors them. It says their story is bigger than we allowed it to be. It says their survival was not just about endurance. It was about connection. It was about taking in the stranger, the lost, the shipwrecked, and making them part of the whole. It says that strength is not purity. Strength is adaptation. Strength is the ability to weave new threads into an old fabric without tearing it apart. And that is a lesson that reaches far beyond genetics. It reaches into how we see ourselves, how we see others, how we understand movement, migration, and meeting. We live in a time that fears crossing borders, that fears mixing, that fears the unknown. But the human story is built on crossing, built on mixing, built on the unknown becoming familiar. The Apache carry that truth in their cells. They have carried it for centuries. They carried it while historians drew straight lines. They carried it while academics argued over dates. They carried it while the world tried to fit them into a box. Now the box is open. Now the lines are fading. Now the water is speaking. We are living in an age where technology finally catches up to intuition, where machines confirm what elders never forgot, where laboratories validate what stories always hinted at. This is not a victory for science over tradition. It is a reunion. Two ways of knowing finally shaking hands. Two languages finally translating each other. Two maps finally overlapping. And in that overlap, we find something rare. We find humility. We find wonder. We find the quiet realization that we are all smaller than the earth and larger than our records. The researchers who published these findings did not claim to have the final answer. They offered a new question. They opened a door. They invited us to step through and look around. That is what good science does. It does not close books. It opens them. It does not end conversations. It starts them. It does not demand belief. It asks for curiosity. And curiosity is exactly what this story demands. Not certainty, not dogma, not rigid loyalty to old textbooks, just curiosity. The willingness to sit with the unknown. The willingness to let the data speak. The willingness to admit that the people we thought we understood were carrying oceans in their blood. So what do we do with a story that refuses to stay still? We listen. We adjust. We let go of the need for neat endings. We accept that history is not a finished book. It is a living conversation. It is written in stone, yes, but also in wind, in water, in blood, in the quiet spaces between what we know and what we are still learning. The Apache were never what we thought. They were never just one thing. They were never confined to a single path, a single origin, a single definition. They were a gathering, a crossing, a survival, a reminder that the earth is smaller than we pretend, and the human family is larger than we admit. The next time you look at a map, remember this. The lines are not real. The borders are temporary. The oceans are not walls. They are bridges waiting for someone brave enough to cross them. And somewhere, in the cells of people walking the desert today, there is proof that someone did, long before we had the words to describe it, long before we had the technology to see it, long before we were ready to believe it. The past is not behind us. It is inside us. And it is still speaking. We just have to be quiet enough to hear it